The Afghan war has two major players, the United States and the Taliban. From the 1980s to 2003, the Taliban was the ruling party of Afghanistan and allowed the terrorist group Al-Qaeda to have camps in the nation of Afghanistan. And in 2003, soon after the 9/11 attacks, it became clear that Afghanistan must be changed by the United States in order to defeat Al-Qaeda. So, the United States launched a war against the Taliban, the ruling members, and ousted them in the same year of 2003. From then on, the Taliban has been made into an insurgency group who forever fights the United States and the current Afghan military for what they would call rightful power of their state. The United States mainly wanted to eliminate all options for the Al-Qaeda in terms of looking for a certain country to seek refuge in. And with the Afghan war, it had been clear that the Taliban were giving Afghanistan as a nation for the Al-Qaeda to seek refuge in. However, the United States wanted to avoid this, and that was their security concern priority, which was to eliminate all options for the Al-Qaeda, and that is the reason the Afghan war is waging now. The main goal for the United States is to have control over the non-renewable resource of oil. Economically, this is their main priority. And if the Taliban were to gain control of Afghanistan, the United States' hold on oil would greatly lessen. The Afghan war politically, its reasons are rooted in control over the state of Afghanistan. With the Taliban, their main goal is to gain control of Afghanistan once again and institute Sharia law. The United States is planning to avoid that happening and to institute and sustain the current Afghan government. The Taliban institutes Sharia law, which is one of the strictest forms of Islamic law ever known, and one of the strictest forms of law in general. And with Sharia law, it's a religious motivation for the Taliban in order to regain control of their country and institute these laws nationwide all over Afghanistan. In this case, incitement to genocide does not exist. This is because there was no public outcry for the elimination of a certain group. The Taliban, of course, was a group, but under the conventions of genocide, the Taliban is an entity that genocide is not considered in for the UN Charter on Genocide. The UN Convention on the Punishment and Preventability of the Crime of Genocide states that incitement to genocide would entail a public outcry or a public advocating for the elimination of a certain group or ethnicity. In the case of the Afghan war, this does not apply. Thus, this would not be considered genocide, not only under these UN conventions, but under other UN conventions considering genocide as well. In 1948, the International Military Tribunal, otherwise known as the IMT, held world-known cases for a military officer who was tasked with creating the Nazi newspaper. This newspaper incited the killing of Jews every month and on a very mass scale. The actions taken here in Germany and their ruling of the International Military Tribunal does count this as actions for incitement toward genocide. For the Afghan war, there are no such spreadings or claims, so their incitement to genocide does not exist in Afghanistan. However, Germany trials in 1948, the Nuremberg trials, definitely prove incitement to genocide does exist. Some could consider the Afghan war genocide. After all, the drone strikes combined with overall military irresponsibility and lots of aggressiveness from the Taliban has all these things have led to too many civilian casualties. And some would go as far to say that these civilian casualties are the genocide, and that these civilian casualties create what would be considered a genocide. On the other hand, there's many reasons why the Afghan war would be considered, and is considered, not a genocide. For example, the main goal of the offenders, the United States, is to eliminate the Taliban and institute a more democratic, more liberal government. This plan has been accomplished, and although there have been civilian casualties, it has been clear through the actions of the United States that their plan was not to, and is not to, eliminate civilians. It is to eliminate what is now a terrorist group, the Taliban, from the nation of Afghanistan.
The Taliban can be argued to not hold any responsibility in the Afghan war, seeing as they're the ones attacked. The U.S. is the aggressor in the Afghan war, and the Taliban are only simply trying to defend themselves and make their way back to controlling Afghanistan. The Taliban can also be argued to have some responsibility for the Afghan war because they are killing civilians during this war, the Afghan war, which is like a genocide and could implicate them in inciting this genocide. The current government in Afghanistan can also be implicated in the Afghan war. The U.S. trains the Afghan military as well as the Afghan police to fight and withstand the Taliban. So they are also fighting in the war, and as a result, they are also issuing some casualties to civilians, which does implicate them in the incitement to genocide. The current government in Afghanistan can also be implicated in the Afghan war. The U.S. trains the Afghan military as well as the Afghan police to fight and withstand the Taliban. So they are also fighting in the war, and as a result, they are also issuing some casualties to civilians, which does implicate them in the incitement to genocide. The government of Afghanistan can also be argued to not be responsible for the Afghan war and the incitement to genocide, because the United States is using the Afghanistan government as an extension of itself, and the Afghan government is irresponsible, really, really irresponsible, and it's known that they are irresponsible. So everything that they do is kind of the fault of the United States, not the fault of the Afghanistan government. The United States does bear responsibility in the Afghan war situation because this war has been going on for more than 10 years, and when it started it was so broad and so unfocused that everything bad that has happened as a result of the broadness of this war and the length of this war is the fault of the United States. The United States doesn't bear responsibility with the situation in the Afghan war because they're simply reacting accordingly to the 9/11 attacks and everything that went down back then. And they're doing the best they can to handle the situation to make sure it never happens again and to punish those responsible. So, how are we going to solve this problem with the Afghan war without using the ICC? I'm glad you asked. The way we are going to solve this conflict is by telling the U.S. and having the U.S. stop their involvement with the Middle East and especially Afghanistan, because the Taliban hates the United States. And with the United States leaving, this could be a compromise. This could lead to a compromise with Afghanistan and the Taliban, which would mend their rift and hopefully stop genocide from happening. But, however, we do realize the problems with this solution, because the Afghanistan government is quite terrible and would not be comfortable, competent, or experienced in handling this situation on their own, so that could lead to more problems in itself.
So the International Crimes Court would find three different people, or three different powers culpable here. The United States, the Afghan government, and the Taliban. So the United States bears much responsibility in this case. It was their idea or their plan to invade Afghanistan and oust the Taliban government. This was very important, and this is a very important factor because it was the start of the Afghan war. Punishment for the United States would be large economic sanctions. For a decade of war that has led to much turmoil in the Middle East, economic sanctions seem to be the most effective plan for United States punishment by the International Crimes Court. Also, the Afghan government. Being new, the Afghan government should not receive too harsh of a punishment, for that could make the government even more destabilized than it already is. So, punishment for the Afghan government should be strict enforcement of international law codes, such as any codes that reflect one government or the international government using foreign policy. For example, maybe an Afghan prime minister would like to conduct sanctions with an Iraqi or Iran leader. These should be heavily enforced and heavily monitored by the international or by any trusted IGO. That would be a fair punishment for the Afghan government. And as for the Taliban, they're very culpable in this situation because these are the people who were in power but now choose to terrorize and hold people responsible for and almost kill innocent civilians. This is unacceptable. The Taliban is now an insurgent group and definitely should be considered a terrorist group by international law as well as domestic and generally known as a terrorist group. Their punishment should be any restrictions from getting any nation, or in this case, not being able to take control over the nation of Afghanistan. We should do everything in our power as an international community and by the ICC in order to make sure that the nation of Afghanistan is not controlled by the ruthless Taliban.